If you didn't see the first part of this series on Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, check it out in the description below. TLDR, she defrauded investors out of nearly $1 billion using her vag power and remains unrepentant to this day, despite her fraud being laid bare for the entire world to see. Basically, the premise of this two-parter, outside of never trusting a bitch with this much eyeball showing, is that millennial women in particular have been told our entire lives that we are so super smart and are such amazing creatures that we can do anything we set our brilliant minds to. Parents, teachers, and society at large embedded this you go girl mentality into virtually all of their teachings, our entire lives. And, as was plainly foreseeable, the chickens have now come home to roost, so to speak. I should start this video by saying that I truly love Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Truly. I have a warm affection for her that feels almost like a friendship. She says the dumbest things I have ever heard with such marked self-assurance that I'm not even kidding. My affection for her borders on admiration. Probably, though, it's just the warm feeling of satisfaction that I get by watching an entitled female millennial minority sink the Democrats. All the while, no one on the left criticizes her. Because vagina. Where do I even start with AOC? By the way, I hate calling her that. It makes me sound like a hipster douchebag, but I'm not saying her irritatingly long name repeatedly, so I will reluctantly abbreviate. I guess we should start from the beginning. Now, normally, I wouldn't begrudge someone for having an upper middle class upbringing or for any of the other familial stuff that we're going to be discussing. But she built her identity on these things. And she did say this. She also said, "It is nice. Growing up, it was a good town for working people. My mom scrubbed toilets so I could live here, and I grew up seeing how the zip code one is born in determines much of their opportunity. Your attempt to strip me of my family, my story, my home, and my identity is exemplary of how scared you are of the power of all four of these things." I think it's necessary to put these comments in context because she's demanding that we view her as an impoverished, oppressed champion of the working class. AOC grew up in wealthy Westchester. She moved there when she was 5 because the Bronx was so dangerous and the schools were terrible. Yorktown is a safe, prosperous community. Her father was an architect, CEO of his own company, who, according to Glassdoor, probably made the equivalent of around $80,000 adjusted for inflation. I'm sure there were some fluctuations in salary based on the real estate market, but he made a steady living once he started his company in 1986 and died before his salary would have taken a big hit during the housing crisis. He died of lung cancer when she was 19, which, although I couldn't find any information on whether or not he was a smoker, 80 to 90% of lung cancers are attributed to smoking. This is from Heavy and, as always, is linked in the description below. When Alexandria was 19 years old, a sophomore at BU, Sergio died of cancer. His death threw the family into turmoil. After Sergio's death, the family struggled financially. They became embroiled in a battle with the Westchester County Surrogates Court, which handles the estates of people who die without a will. The family feared that they might lose their Westchester home. Eventually, they were allowed to sell the home at a profit. But Blanca struggled to provide for the family, and after Alexandria graduated from college, she took on extra work to help keep the family afloat. Alexandria began bartending and waitressing in addition to her job in a nonprofit that provides leadership training for Latino youths. The fact that she portrays her mother as some kind of working class hero is a mischaracterization. The truth is that her father died young, likely from a totally preventable cancer, and he failed to protect his family financially. They bought the Yorktown home for $150,000 in 1991, and they were able to sell it for $355,000 in 2016. So I'm a little unclear how a man with a good, steady salary for AOC's entire life was unable to pay down a $120,000 mortgage, assuming he put 20% down, over the course of 17 years, let alone when he died in 2008, to be so underwater that his family thought that they were going to lose the house, irrespective of the housing crisis. Not to mention that he left no will, and presumably there was nothing for the family but debt. If it's true that she had to work multiple waitressing jobs and her mother had to scrub toilets just to keep the home, there must have been a significant amount of debt outside of the mortgage. I'm suspicious of all of this. It seems to me that there had to be a fair amount of financial irresponsibility involved. AOC also claims that she was caught between two worlds, Yorktown and the Bronx. I couldn't find any information on whether her parents got divorced. It seems they didn't, but she said that her father stayed in the Bronx to work at his architecture firm while she, her brother, and mother lived in their Yorktown home. I also find this suspicious because it's not a crazy commute from her home to her father's work, certainly not unmanageable enough to necessitate breaking up a family and carting kids between the two locations. Nonetheless, her father and mother's financial irresponsibility seems to have screwed the family, and her mom was reduced to the undignified job of cleaning toilets in order to save the house they couldn't afford, and, by the way, no longer needed because her kids had already left the home in AOC's case, or were about to anyway in her younger brother's case. Well, maybe not in his case because he's a musician or an artist or something stupid like that. Still, it would have been just her mom and her brother, or just her mom. You don't need a house that you bought in a wealthy neighborhood to have access to better schools as an empty nester. Just downsize. AOC has also repeatedly honored single mothers and claims the death of her father led to her being raised by a single mother. When a woman's husband dies, she's a widow, not a single mom. And AOC was 19. Her brother is just a few years younger. She was not raised by a single mother, unless she's hiding her parents' separation, which, considering the claims that he did not live in the family house, I suppose is possible. That is a really weird situation to me. She said in an Instagram post, "My mama was born, raised in Puerto Rico, lived in poverty, blah, blah. She met my father, a Bronx boy. They married, moved to New York City. She didn't speak English. My parents started from scratch, new languages, new life. Then came me, and they moved to start over again so I could have an education. Mommy mopped floors, drove school buses, and answered phones. She did whatever she needed to do for me. When my father died, she was left a single mother of two, and again, she had to start over. After he passed, we almost lost our home, so we sold it and started over and over and over." I found this particularly dishonest because she conveniently doesn't mention that her father died when she was an adult, and her brother very nearly was. Nor does she mention that they nearly lost a home they no longer needed, almost certainly through decades of poor financial decisions. Nor does she mention that ultimately they were able to sell it for a giant profit. Nor does she mention that capitalism allowed her father, through his hard work, to rise through the ranks and, despite his impoverished upbringing, become the CEO of his own architecture firm, which in turn allowed him to move the family to a straight-up wealthy community. This is the biggest flaw in her casting herself as a product of the Bronx and a working-class family. The truth is, her family worked hard to get her out of the Bronx because it sucks there, and they worked even harder to leave the working class. They were dismayed when they had to return to those kinds of jobs after her father's death. I would say that AOC inherited her mother and father's financial incompetence, but it turns out that this widely publicized story of her inability to afford DC rent turned out to be complete bullshit. AOC claimed to the New York Times that despite being on the brink of making $174,000 a year, she couldn't manage to scrape together first month's rent and a security deposit for her new apartment. "I have 3 months without a salary before I'm a member of Congress, so how do I get an apartment?" Those little things are very real. AOC reported having between $15,000 and $50,000 in her checking account as of the end of April 2018, according to a financial disclosure report she submitted to the clerk of the U.S. House of Representatives. The financial disclosure also reveals that she has an investment account valued between $1,000 and $15,000. Even though the median rent price in DC is $2,700 and she had somewhere between $16,000 and $65,000 in savings and investments, she can't figure out how to make this apartment thing work. Let's give her some federal budgeting tasks, you guys. So she can't do basic math, or she was planning to spend an astronomical amount of money during the 3 months in question, or she's just a damn liar. I'll let you folks decide. There are two kinds of people to whom socialism appeals. One includes impoverished, unskilled people with low IQs who can scarcely hope to ever compete in the free market. The other includes those so wealthy, so privileged, that they are disconnected with the plight of the average person. AOC seems to be a dangerous combination, a little from column A, a little from column B. Let's first take a look at this democratic socialism, because I'm pretty sure those are contradictory terms and this isn't really a thing. I know Wikipedia is a useless source, but their definition is helpful. A political philosophy that advocates political democracy alongside social ownership of the means of production, with an emphasis on self-management and democratic management of economic institutions within a market or some form of decentralized, planned socialist economy. Wow, what nonsense. The social ownership of the means of production is collective ownership, even if owned by workers. Need I remind you of the many historical precedents involving land collectivization? Check out my video series on the Holodomor, link below, in which this philosophy caused the genocide of probably more than 10 million people. In democratic socialism, the collectivization of the means of production is meant to be by the workers. But who dictates and delineates this? They also advocate for wealth redistribution, property ownership caps, and massive government intervention in terms of mandating social equality. How on earth can you claim to be an advocate of democracy while also giving the government these kinds of sweeping powers? The result of this philosophy and conventional socialism is going to be authoritarianism every single time. The workers, despite collective ownership, have no way to check the power of the government. Democratic socialism, despite these supposed deviations from Marxist-Leninist philosophy, is really just one and the same. Don't let anybody tell you differently. Now that we understand her personal history of financial ignorance that led to her adoption of the totally contradictory terms democratic socialist, let's take a look at the baby born of her idiocy and her idealism, shall we? There has been much commentary on the Green New Deal, but I really just wanted to unpack the most breathtakingly stupid parts. The full text is below. This is from the Green Party website. The Green New Deal will convert the decaying fossil fuel economy into a new green economy that is environmentally sustainable, economically secure, and socially just. The Green New Deal starts transitioning to 100% green renewable energy, no nukes or natural gas, by 2030. It would immediately halt any investment in fossil fuels, including natural gas and related infrastructure. The Green New Deal will guarantee full employment and generate up to 20 million new living wage jobs, as well as make the government the employer of last resort with a much-needed major public jobs program. I've got to admit, it's pretty adorable. It's like some wide-eyed sixth graders wrote it. It's also utterly impossible. So how does she even propose that we achieve this? The implementation of the Green New Deal will revive the economy, turn the tide on climate change, and make wars for oil obsolete. This latter result, in turn, enables a 50% cut in the military budget, since maintaining bases all over the world to safeguard fossil fuel supplies and routes of transportation could no longer be justified. That military savings of several $100 billion per year would go a long way toward creating green jobs at home. On top of that, the Green New Deal largely pays for itself in healthcare savings from the prevention of fossil fuel-related diseases, including asthma, heart attacks, strokes, and cancer. This is insane. First of all, reliance on fossil fuel is an inescapable part of being in an industrialized society. If we could avoid it, we already would be. Secondly, retrofitting all buildings, in addition to her other absurd proposals like universal healthcare and job guarantees, will cost an estimated $93 trillion. And despite her claims, we do not yet have the technology to do what she's demanding here. As such, I'm skeptical that we can even put an accurate price tag on these literally impossible tasks. The Green New Deal is not only a major step towards ending unemployment for good, but also a tool to fight the corporate takeover of our democracy and exploitation of the poor and people of color. It will provide a just transition with a priority on providing resources to workers displaced from the fossil fuel industry, low-income communities, and communities of color most impacted by climate change. I find this particularly funny because AOC claims she's concerned with corporate and governmental overreach while openly regarding herself as a democratic socialist, whereby workers collectivize the means of production and the federal government dictates the extent of private land ownership. It baffles me that she can say that this would not lend to corporate takeover and exploitation of the working class. I'll give someone a cookie if they can explain to me how a staggering amount of government intervention can protect the working class from the government, or for that matter, from corporations working in tandem with the government. I encourage you to read more about the Green New Deal because I barely scratched the surface of its infeasibility. Every point in the text is easily refuted, and if implemented, it would be economically and culturally catastrophic. I do think there's a fair amount of skepticism on the left, judging by Feinstein's reaction to this army of tiny Marxists barging into her office recently. She seems to have barely resisted spanking this little lispy brat on the spot.
Well, it's not going to get turned around in 10 years. What we can do,
Senator, if this doesn't get turned around in 10 years, you're looking at the faces of the people who are going to be living with these consequences.
The government is supposed to be for the people and by the people and all for the people.
You know what's interesting about this group is I've been doing this for 30 years. I know what I'm doing.
Nancy Pelosi and other Dems keep calling the Green New Deal innovative and ambitious. That's just leftist doublespeak for infeasible and totally utopian. It's never going to happen. And even an attempt to make a fraction of these things happen would virtually bankrupt the country and yield none of the desired results. Is this who we really want to be influencing the masses? To have actual governmental power, someone who has no understanding of the economic toll that such a policy would render. Is this who we want to be in charge? Is she in charge already?
The power is in the person who's trying, regardless of the success. If you're trying, you've got all the power. You're driving the agenda. You're doing all this stuff. Like, I just introduced Green New Deal 2 weeks ago, and it's creating all of this conversation. Why? Because no one else has even tried. So people are like, oh, it's unrealistic. Oh, it's vague. Oh, it doesn't address this little minute thing. And I'm like, you try. You do it.
Right.
Because you're not. Because you're not. So until you do it, I'm the boss.
That's
How about that?
You heard it here.
Is this who we want to influence cultural norms with her huge social media following? To encourage a nation with a dismal birth rate to further self-destruct?
There's scientific consensus that the lives of children are going to be very difficult. And it does lead, I think, young people to have a legitimate question. You know, is it okay to still have children?
The solution, and this goes for all Western men, get millennial women under control. We need to be taken down a notch. No matter that her pussy boyfriend doesn't have a chance in hell to subdue AOC's wide-eyed insanity. A ginger feminist. Oh my God. Outside of her entitlement and a lifetime of undeserved praise, the real problem with AOC and those like her is that reality be damned, facts be damned, associated costs with a plan that can never, ever come to fruition be damned. They have the moral high ground, and you should be ashamed of yourself.
I think that there's a lot of people more concerned about being precisely, factually, and semantically correct than about being morally right.
The destruction of our culture isn't going to be at the hands of a smirking white male. It will be at the hands of an ethnically ambiguous 20-something with a 90 IQ and hot tits. Don't be fooled. Thanks, folks, and I'll see you soon. Bye.